history of a German mother who came here after the Second World War and almost didn't quite make it, in as much as it was the only migrant ship to have sunk en route to Australia in the late 50s. And so it caught fire in the Indian Ocean and they were rescued and managed to make their way to Australia. But on my father's side, my late father was a Walwong Kamilaroi man, and he grew up on Kuruna Mission, and he was born a handful of years after Federation, in fact. So there's a real long link through history and time. And he grew up on an Aboriginal mission in northwest New South Wales, just south of Tamworth. And then he passed away when I was quite young, and so then we moved on away from Gadigal country, and we lived for a number of years on Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales, opposite the Pacific Ocean. And so that relationship to water has always been an important part of my story. And then later on, having spent a number of formative years in New South Wales, we moved to Kulin Nation country here in Melbourne, and I've spent the best part of my adult life and growing up and becoming educated and really sort of learning from Kulin Nation. And so it's really important to sort of set up that understanding. And so I'm one of 9 children, and I'm both the youngest, but also the oldest son. So because we have a sort of a blended heritage through my father and his and having step siblings on one side, step siblings on another side, and then myself and my sister. So you can see there's an interesting sort of spread of both ages and histories and understandings. And so what you just heard now is really about setting up a capacity to build trust and connection. And I haven't mentioned in any sense really what I do. I've really mentioned who I am and where I'm from. And so to sort of finish up, to give some context, in many respects, the collective voices we'll hear today capture what I do, and it's the 3 A's. So I'm an architect, I'm also an academic, and I'm also have a sort of an artistic sensibility which really sort of pivots towards activism as well and advocacy. And I think you'll find in the speakers we have today will certainly touch on all of those different domains. And so if I'd just like to hand over to our next speaker, who's a fantastic and nationally recognised artist of great standing, Peter Clancy, to give a bit of an introduction to who you are and where you're from.
Oh wow, that was a very generous introduction. Thanks, Jefa. I am from Melbourne and I grew up in Melbourne. My family, my ancestral family, through my grandmother, from the Bangarang Nation, which is up near Echuca on the Murray River. And my grandmother was a part of the stolen generation in the sense that her mother was with a man called, I should introduce, and this is Edgar. This is my son, who this particular time is the time when he kind of is dinner time, and so we just had to kind of incorporate it. But this is Edgar. So so I'm a mother of one, almost 14-month-old. So my grandmother was part of the stolen generation and disconnected from her heritage. I was very close to my grandmother and have a really strong bond with her, but she's no longer with us. I have one brother, and I grew up with my parents. We grew up in North Melbourne, so in inner city in Melbourne, and I actually haven't travelled that far. I live in Coburg, so I've tended to stay within the same geographical location. Although at the moment we're staying in Warrandyte because there's level crossing removal works in Coburg, and the noises and the diesel pollution is just incredible. So we're lucky to be we're just near Pound Bend, which is a really important Woiwurrung site, and it's where William Barak was born. And it's been really, really beautiful to spend time amongst nature and the trees, and compared to spending time in a very dense kind of city. So yeah, as I said, my kind of, I've spent a lot of time within the one kind of area, and that's, I guess that's really, really formed. What are you doing there? Really formed my my identity, and living within a similar location. I think that's probably about all, I guess, before I get on to what I do, which is, it's very interesting, Jifa, because I'm so used to, with talks, you talk about what you do and what you've done.
Yeah.
But it's really beautiful to come back to who you are and where you're from, which is a really, really interesting process, because it is, usually it's so much focused on, instead of you, it's like things that you've done. And so you kind of, this has been a really interesting process for me to kind of talk in this way, in a formal sense. So I think that's probably as much as, yeah.
Well, we'll get to know each other further through the conversation, I'm sure, as the conversation unfolds. And so thanks for giving a bit of a sense of the backstory of who you are.
It wasn't much, sorry.
No, that's terrific. As much or as little as you wish to reveal. So I'd like to now hand over to an eminent academic of national, if not international standing, and very much an expert in her field. Professor, or is it associate professor? I can't recall now, Elizabeth.
I think we've got, I'm not sure. No, I don't care.
But we'd certainly like to know a little bit about you, Elizabeth, and get a bit of a sense of the backstory as well, as a way of introducing us to this conversation.
Well, first of all, I'm actually sitting on Ngarrindjeri land, and I'm sitting on the clan land of the Ngarrindjeri. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also that this is the unceded land of Ngarrindjeri. So I was born on Boandik land, which is around what you'd know as Mount Gambier. And I spent time between my grandparents, who lived in a little place called Sea Lake, and a place on Boandik land, moving between the two of them. We don't know a lot about my grandmother. We lived next door at Sea Lake to what was then a fringe camp. Like you, Jifa, my father is a refugee from Germany, except he came out during the war with a falsified name and a new Catholic religion. So I grew up really with no shoes, and in Mount Gambier, you know, it's a very, very strange life, because it was full of refugees, and there's full of refugees who worked really hard. So it's a big work ethic there. And I still have my river there, and I still have my mountain there. I married a kuru, or leader, of a family group called Whānau Apanui, and I was very lucky to be put on to the ancestral line of Whānau Apanui. and Whānuapanui of Aotearoa, New Zealand, is in the top of the Bay of Plenty. And my husband, who's named Tamahai, which is one of our leader. So as a female leader, we do what is a mihai, which is we state our mountain, our river, and our clan. So my mountain is Mount Gambier, my river, or my muku, is the Glenelg, and my clan is Whānuapanui. I'm the very proud mother of 4 sons who are scattered, unfortunately, around the world, but that's a good thing. But one of the things I'm proudest about is that I have 2 grandchildren, and English is their 3rd language. So they're growing up on a remote community in Yalata, and so I speak Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara, and we are really hoping that they are able to have a full background of that before they have to fit into a Western world. But there's a few phone calls. They have discovered planes. So it's a really nice, because to me, this is a very natural way to introduce yourself. I find it, as the rest of us do, I find it very strange when people say to me, "What do you do?" and they don't care about who I am, because to me, my background has formed me. And as you said earlier, sitting in a room full of suits and not understanding that you once lived on the edge of a fringe camp is a very strange way to go about it. And most people see me as a professor, see me walking down the street in black and all of these sort of things. But my background and my family, or my whānau, are the most important things to me.
Terrific. Well, thanks for sharing that, Elizabeth. So we're going to begin a bit of a conversation, and the stimulus of this conversation really is looking at how do we actually start to sustain allyship and what it means in the practicing on Indigenous land. And if the starting premise is to acknowledge the over 250 distinct language groups across 600 distinct dialects across this vast landmass and continent that is Australia, then we can certainly say that we are operating, living, working, learning on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And so that presupposes some interesting questions. And I certainly do a lot of public speaking throughout the year. And I found this quite an intriguing provocation or series of provocations, and certainly a level of sophistication in weaving through a connection to Indigenous culture as it relates to the longevity of a career as it unfolds over time, and how in many respects it is often non-linear. And so if I even just think of my own journey to where I am today as an architect, is I actually started through study in political science, of all things. So you can see sometimes where we start to where we end can often be quite circuitous. But interestingly, here we have is a series of propositions and provocations which hopefully will reveal some sort of hidden meaning and understanding of how we position ourselves, how we develop our own ethical and philosophical understanding of our contribution within the fields in which we engage. And so to that end, I'd like to sort of take you on a little bit of a teaser just as a way to prompt the conversation. And so in the first instance, I think it's always important to use and embed language. So yama, or welcome, as we'll say on Kamilaroi country. And this particular quotation, I think, captures it quite nicely. Design creates culture, culture shapes values, values determine the future. So you can see there's an underpinning ethic here which links culture to values and understanding the value proposition. And so this is from a former president of the International Council of Design. And I think in the current context, as things stand, the time is now. The time is now to have these sort of conversations, to embed and to infuse a sensibility that starts to talk to some of the complex relationships and understandings of the layers of history and memory of this particular place. And so we're seeing in the media today, on the back of Black Lives Matter, a real awakening and a repositioning of the understanding of history and the contribution of some of the difficult truths that reside not only here but across the globe. And so this global movement is really acknowledging some of those difficult truths, but also confronting through the youth, particularly of today, to say, well, what is my role? What is my contribution? And how can I affect meaningful change in these turbulent times? And so it is certainly, we hear the word unprecedented, but it is unprecedented in many respects. You know, on the top of this, we're dealing with a global pandemic. And I think that provides a bit of a reset to understand how we need to respond to these new dynamics. And so, you know, to that end, we're starting to see a reassertion of some of the difficult truths and some of the characters in history who have been complicit, particularly in the colonial story, which has often supplanted some of the deep knowledge and wisdom of First Nations people around the globe. And we know that the colonial project has reached far and wide across this vast globe that we live on. And there's certainly an understanding that, you know, there are different ways of doing things, and there is certainly some great wisdom and understanding and knowledge systems that reside among First Nations people. And so how do we start to think about that, not only in the context of activism and facilitating Indigenous agency and voice within propositions, but looking how that manifests itself within the built environment. And those of us who are engaging with the breadth of disciplines that encompass the built environment, what is the contribution that can be made and how do we go about it? So going back to these notions of values, in some respects we understand the values proposition of why we need to engage in these conversations, but the question is, how do we translate that into meaningful action, particularly in terms of design in a culturally responsive way? And so we're seeing a lot of projects which are starting to position a new way of thinking. So whether it's the Tunaminawaya Mulbohina Memorial by Brooke Andrew and Trent Walter, which on the surface looks quite playful. We see, you know, what looks like a beautiful native garden, and there's a swing, and there's some colourful, you know, newspaper stands behind there. But when you delve a little bit deeper, you actually realise what you're seeing is a homage to the first two publicly executed men in Melbourne, two Aboriginal men, related to Truganini in Tasmania. And then there's a story which seeks to be told here of revealing those hidden connections to history and making the invisible visible. And so whether it's, you know, further projects and interventions within the public realm, often ephemeral, but now more and more we're starting to look at how we can actually facilitate permanent recognition of some of these difficult stories. So Over Obelisk, which has been done by Sibling Architecture, is a really interesting proposition where you envelop a marker to the colonial experience, which essentially etches within this obelisk words to the effect that there were no Indigenous people here. There was, in fact, this notion of terra nullius. And so by enveloping, creating a different vantage point, a different way of viewing, we then start to challenge some of those preconceptions and some of the distorted histories that, you know, Australia hasn't fully grappled with. Similarly, the terrific work of Daniel Boyd and Edition Office with the Indigenous Memorial to Black Diggers in Canberra, again, is a really great provocation which holds the mirror, literally and figuratively, up to those who engage with it, reflecting country back through this sort of lenticular lens in a way, and then fusing cultural expression within the very fibre of this particular intervention. And similarly, we're seeing other provocations where we're starting to look at ways of inverting an understanding of some of those challenging stories that reside in place. And so those connections to country become really important, and understanding some of those elements that speak to and challenges some of the stereotypes, the kitsch, the cliche, the stereotypical. And so in the Victorian context particularly, we're starting to grapple with this in much more meaningful ways, where we've legislated for treaty conversations. We're looking at truth and reconciliation in ways which have never been done before, where we see a First Nations assembly gathered together to hear the voices of Indigenous people and embedding that within part of normative experiences here in Victoria. And then we're starting to see, even among the Indigenous fraternity at universities across the globe, where we're starting to challenge some of the standard methodologies and practices, and starting to pivot towards the potential to indigenize design curriculum, for instance, and starting to look deeply within ourselves and say, is there something missing? Is there an opportunity here to pivot towards ways in which we embed with Indigenous ways of knowledge, ways of being and knowing? And similarly, we're seeing within the broader design industry an understanding of how we start to grapple with and engage with complexity, the socially complex environment of so many different and distinct language groups, with some of the challenges of the different experiences of country, the different topographies, the different landscapes, the different understanding of the climatic conditions, and understanding the notion of caring for country. And all these elements are starting to come to the fore. And we're looking at ways to facilitate Indigenous voices within the processes of starting to make these changes. We're starting to acknowledge the value of things like a reconciliation action plan, and putting in place strategies which start to foreground the capacity to engage in these particular ways. And so to that end, we're having a conversation here which is starting to look at how do we start to build relationships and allies in support of some of these bigger causes and some of these what could deem to be wicked problems. And equally, how do we do it across the length and duration of our careers? And so I've been practicing in architecture for over 25 years now. And so what has been quite clear and apparent in recent times over the last 5 to 10 years is there's been a shift. There's been a marked shift to start to embrace some of those histories and to engage with our connection to over 3,000 generations of 67,000 of 1,000 years of history of this place, continuous occupation, the oldest continuing living culture on the planet. And so these become really important moments of how we start to engage with that. And equally, what we're wanting to do is understand how it starts to entwine and embed and infuse throughout our careers at different moments. And obviously, we're all going on a learning journey. So I'm here on Kulin Nation country. This is not my mob. There are 38 distinct language groups across Victoria, for instance. So in many respects, all the processes and methodologies and thinking that needs to be brought to the table as one engages with a range of different Indigenous peoples, communities, stakeholders, knowledge keepers, is I equally need to go through the same process as any non-Indigenous person does. Certainly there is a sensibility that I can bring, but uniquely I need to be mindful and find a way in to be culturally responsive and respectful through design practice. And similarly, how do we start to embed Indigenous theories and knowledge systems? And so we're starting to reveal through time the sophistication of Indigenous knowledge. We see, for instance, about 3.5, 4 hours southwest of where I'm located today, a sophisticated aquaculture system that predates the pyramids, that has gained World Heritage listing on the Budgebine cultural landscape down Portland Way, where the volcanic eruption created an opportunity. So the lava stone was harvested to create permanent settlement stone houses, which challenges some of those preconceptions that Indigenous culture and design practice was only ephemeral. And similarly, we see, across this vast land, challenges of history. So Indigenous people are believed to be the first bakers. Indigenous people use ancient knowledge systems of reading country to create fire practices to manage the landscape, to groom the landscape for human occupation. And similarly, how we think about this as it relates to time. And so when I think about time, particularly through an Indigenous lens, it's not linear. Time is an arbitrary construction in many respects. The 7 days a week, the 24 hours a day, the 12 months of the year. In Indigenous culture, invariably time is cyclical. It responds to the ebbs and flows of the seasons. And so these are the sort of ideas which can start to infuse our own way of thinking about design practice, and similarly starting to build practical steps towards relationships, Indigenous communities, and the like. And so that is hopefully a bit of a sense of where we're heading in this conversation. And this is going to be a bit of an open-ended conversation amongst the three speakers. And hopefully I've set the scene and opened it up. So I'd very much sort of welcome some reflections on some of these key themes which have been woven through as part of the introduction to this conversation.
I'd sort of like to make a few comments about some of the things that you've said there. And I think that in terms of communication, that you're dead on the money. And that while we don't have 4 seasons in, across Australia, many places have 8, some have 2, some have 12. All of this information is just coming out. And I think the other thing that really resonated with me was the cyclic manner in which communications takes place when you're in community, when you're with your mob. So there's that relief. So you might be talking about something quite serious, and then you have a laugh because it's too serious to keep talking about. And that sort of cyclic notion of Indigenous life is really important, because even with the dark humour, it's timeless, and it's the way of actually communicating, because there's sometimes so much pain invested in this that it's a very important aspect. And I'd actually like you to reflect that on a communication perspective.
Yeah, so, and I think Peter could certainly add some further views on some of these ideas, but this notion that time is cyclical, but also it is multifaceted and simultaneous. So often we talk about this idea of past, present, and future as happening simultaneously. So while we might reference the past, it carries through into the now and into the future, but equally the present informs the future, and it's so multi-dimensional. What's your thoughts on that, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a very time in terms of the way that you were just talking about, in terms of the past influencing the future and the present. It's all a matter of perspective, really, in terms of like who's past and what history and whose history are we talking about. And it also has a sense of history when it's reflected on, you have a different perspective of it over different periods of time. So yeah, I think time is an incredibly fluid notion, and the way that we understand history and the way that we understand different aspects of history over different time periods is really interesting. It's not such a binary notion. I think it's incredibly fluid. Yeah, and it's really interesting thinking about time and the way that, well, time in terms of, I mean, there's seasonal time, thinking about, but also time in terms of the history of the country and the history of Australia. And it seems that there's two, you know, there's the kind of white history, and then there's First Nation history. And especially when I was kind of growing up, there was just not enough kind of interfolding and enough extended in terms of, you know, 3,000 generations. The work that I was working on where I was exploring a massacre site on Djadjawurrung country, I did a photographic project where I overlaid photographs of the same site on top of each other. And so I was trying to give a sense of place and history, and how that's place, like it's so complex in terms of all the places where we are now and how they exist in the present, whereas for so many generations the places where we are now were so different. And I think it's that sense of time that we can tend to forget in terms of thinking about place and our place within where we're living, and our place within where we spend most of our time and where we feel connected to. So I think time in terms of, yeah, place and memory in terms of forgetting that sense of history kind of it's covered over.
Peter, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's one of the things that I find really difficult with the English language is that it doesn't have the words to describe these things, or there is no words of these, and there's no adequate description of them. And when you try to translate them, they come back as something different. Whereas in many of the languages, different languages right across the Pacific, these words have that connection to past and present, whereas the English doesn't have that.
No.
And I find that it's a really hard, if you're you're facing a client and you've got, as Jifa said, a room full of suits, and we've all been there. It is a really difficult thing to make that come out. And I remember the first time I was sitting in a room full of suits, and it was about 15 years ago, and it was American investors and a whole range of different things, all wanting what I didn't. And it was very difficult to find the words.
I mean, I guess, I mean, my kind of way of communicating is more kind of visual. So, but I can, yeah, it is very difficult in the English language because it is a very, it's not as evocative, and it's a very binary kind of stilted language, which, I mean, I only speak English, so I draw on your experience, and it's very interesting to reflect on.
So we're in an interesting point in time, in as much as there is an acute interest and appetite to engage with Indigenous knowledge systems. And often I think there's a sense of walking on cultural eggshells. But how do we start to develop opportunity where non-Indigenous people equally engage with Indigenous culture? And what are the steps or the considerations or the ways of working which starts to empower people to engage with our deeper history, as it relates to particularly, different forms of cultural expression. And so I often say, as an architect, it is just another form of cultural expression. It's equivalent to being a painter, a dancer, a singer. It's just another way of expressing oneself. It just so happens to manifest itself through architecture and design. So, Peter, might you sort of reflect a little bit on how we empower the younger generation to start to build upon their acute interest and appetite and goodwill to engage with the deep histories and knowledge of Indigenous peoples?
I think collaboration is a really collaboration in terms of working with traditional owners. So that is so not a sense of kind of an ownership, more in terms of an openness and a sense of collaboration, but also it's about, developing relationships and taking time and educating yourself. Like, I think it's a very open kind of two-way conversation, but not like being very humble in terms of not feeling that you need to know something straight away, but also feeling like, people aren't going to do everything perfectly straight away, I guess. So it's about not being afraid to kind of make mistakes, I guess, or feel like you need to know. It's about being humble and being really open to learning and open to new ways of thinking and knowledge. But I think it's also about doing research and finding out as much information as possible, so that so for example, when I worked with the Djadjawurrung community, so I'm not a Djadjawurrung person, Bangarang person, it took quite a long time to actually develop relationships, and I needed to go through, to research massacre sites on Djadjawurrung country, I needed to go through the appropriate kind of official steps. So I needed to apply for a cultural heritage permit. And so, there's certain I guess there's just kind of certain ways of doing things, I guess. But I think people educating themselves as much as possible, and then being open to collaboration, and not trying to kind of own a project or own an idea.
So that ability to sort of carve out the requisite time and space to have the conversation, to facilitate knowledge exchange, to build cultural intelligence. Elizabeth, you're very much in the cut and thrust of research. So you, in your work over many years, have engaged with different communities. So how do you go about it? How do you start to find a way in to connect with, different language groups or different communities, and to build those bridges towards building also the knowledge necessary to have those conversations?
So I guess the first thing is to understand is that my work, as basically in research and design, both in early childhood centres and institutional, has always been about activism. And I guess there's a story behind that, was that I was one of the people who was behind Elliot Johnson before the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, one of the many hundreds of people who put $20 in to get Aboriginal legal rights movement set up so that Aboriginal people could have a say here in South Australia. But my first one is that my first rule is that the community's got to ask me to be there. And that might be for a whole host of reasons. They might have wanted an early childhood centre. We've done it, you know, I've worked on a number where I've done the anthropology work for it. Or the architects or the engineers might want me to be there. But we always privilege the voices that are on that land. And that's not just privileging traditional owners. We privilege the smallest person in the room because we want to find out what their lived experience is. And a lot of that is, first of all, for me, is to go in and show them what cutting edge architecture can look like, and also to educate the architects, if I'm working in a team situation, of where the architects, that they know enough about this group of people that they're not going to come out like idiots. Because architects often don't read, and they often haven't got the time to work. You know, some architectural firms work exclusively with certain language groups, but others are working on projects. So I'll go in and work with them and also work with the team. And often we'll privilege every person in the room. Obviously the elders get that. And to me, that's part of the decolonisation of architecture. And for everyone that working is to understand, even for the group concerned, because often they don't, that this is unceded land. They haven't heard, often groups haven't heard that term before. You know, that's a relatively new term in the last, 5 to 10 years. And so it's explaining those concepts. But it's also about relationships because, when I'm working with one mob, it'll be from the recommendation from another mob. So it's about my own integrity, about my family. My kids used to come on field work with me. They're a bit grown. It's very hard to drag a 32-year-old boy on field work. But this is about sharing families, and it's a two-way street. Almost all of the people I've researched with for an ends of thing have actually stayed in our house. This is a personal relationship. This is not about being an anthropologist or being an architect and walking away and then going on to the next project. It's about forming, as you quite rightly did, forming personal relationships. And when it gets to be different, it's just strange and you don't really want to work on the project. But I'll leave that over to you, Peter, because I think you probably know that, and so you get, there's these mobility patterns between communities. So I'll work from Yalata to Jinjinjara, and then I'll go to Kalgoorlie and I'll end up in, and so it kind of works from that. And if you're not, and you sit down and talking, but again about deep listening. And
Peter, so the deep listening is certainly really important because you're moving beyond just hearing to actually listening, and what that often requires is the ability to speak less and listen more. And so, Peter, no doubt you will have had many conversations, and we often talk about the 1,000 cups of tea as the sort of process. What does that mean for your practice? And certainly, how do you navigate this notion of sovereignty also as part of your creative practice? And what might other creatives learn from your sort of methodology? Is it something that is transferable?
I think it is, but I think Elizabeth was talking about something that really resonated for me, and it's about relationships and ongoing relationships. It's about not kind of going in and then moving out. It's about an ongoing relationship, with people, and it's a deep kind of relationship because it's a very deep level of reciprocal relationship that you're actually dealing with, and there's a lot of trust.
Can you explain that a little bit more? A lot of people may not necessarily fully understand this notion of reciprocity. What does that mean for you?
Well, it means that you're in the context that I was talking about. It means that there's a level of trust, and so so for example, in a project that I was working on, talking about massacre sites and such a painful kind of history, there's a very, very deep level of trust which people I was entrusted with these really powerful stories, and I needed to kind of reciprocate that so that Mick and Amos and Rodney, the people that I worked with, and Judjawurrung people, felt comfortable and felt that kind of trusted me. And so I think the reciprocal relationship is that you need, I'm talking about kind of trust, I think. But it's a very deep and emotional process, especially working with subject matter about, such painful histories. And it's quite it's quite terrifying as well, because and I needed to be very, very careful, because it is it's a traumatic subject, of course. And but when I developed the relationship with Mick Burke and Amos Atkinson, who I ended up collaborating with, I actually put a call out to the community. So I spoke about, I'd already developed a relationship with Rodney Carter, who's the CEO of the Judjawurrung Lands Aboriginal Corporation, and he suggested to put a call out to the general community and to see who was interested in potentially finding out more about the project. And Mick and Amos, who I ended up working with, were very interested because they'd been researching the history of massacre sites on Judjawurrung country. And so we kind of met, they were interested in connecting with me because we had been doing similar kind of research. But it's, it was a very emotional time when I actually met them, because it's actually like standing on country where your ancestors were murdered. It's a very, very, very powerful and very emotional process, I guess. I've probably got off topic, but I guess I was talking about reciprocal in terms of trust.
Peter, I imagine...
Presumably shared benefit as well.
Sorry?
Shared benefit and opportunity through the relationship that you're building.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Peter,
Elizabeth?
Peter, I imagine that doing that, I know that one of the parts of my work is that I don't just, if I'm writing a report or I'm writing a piece of research, or I've been given a bit of cultural information, that I don't check it once, I check it 5 times and with different people to check whether that's going to cause shame.
Mm.
And I also check to see how much trauma and how much, you know, because grief and trauma is a huge thing in the Aboriginal community.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can go in there and whoever we are and stir up a heck of a lot of trauma-related issues and then bugger off. I was curious to how you dealt with the intergenerational trauma in looking at that massacre sites.
Well, it was really interesting. When I had an exhibition of the work at the Koori Heritage Trust. Well, stepping back, when I applied for a cultural heritage permit through the Djadjawurrung Clans Aboriginal Corporation, and we very carefully went through ways to kind of manage sense of trauma and you know, addressed, like I had to write quite a bit in terms of, not just write quite a bit, but really consider aspects of bringing up, you know, intergenerational trauma. And so I guess I'd kind of thought a lot about it. And also with the Koori Heritage Trust, we spoke about ways of addressing trauma that maybe from different people, from different areas coming in and viewing the work as well. But I guess when I actually had the exhibition, there were a lot of community, Djadjawurrung community there. And I think, actually, while I'm thinking about it, I think a sense of, and something that you picked up before too, Jifa, it was a sense of, because Mick and Amos worked really, really closely with me with the project, it was their project as well. And so what, you know, I don't feel like it's my, like I feel quite uncomfortable about the fact that it is my work and it was seen as my work and seen as my exhibition, because we shared the project and it was a collaboration. Yeah. And so when
that actually reminds me of a perfect example illustrating that point, where there was a project which was done on community with an architect who was non-Indigenous, and it won a swag of awards. And then people were asking the community, "Oh, you know, wasn't it fantastic that the architect won the award?" And they go, "Yeah, we won that award because we told him what we wanted, and he gave us what we told him to do," sort of thing. So, yeah, that idea of a true collaborative model where there's a meaningful partnership, and that there is equal acknowledgement of the contribution of all voices as part of that experience.
Yeah, well, I think the best thing for me about the exhibition was that we hired a bus to bring community down to Melbourne from Mooroopna, and there were about 40 people that came. And the best thing was like seeing all the kids looking at the photos, and yeah, that was just such a great thing, like having that kind of community being there, but seeing the kids looking at the photos and the families. But I think I was speaking to an elder, a Djadjawurrung elder, during the exhibition, and we were talking about she was asking me how it felt making work at such a site and taking photographs at such a site. And I was incredibly nervous, presenting the work and to the community and at the opening. But in a sense that people actually, like the elder that I was speaking to, was actually, in a sense, took it that I'd shown them a place and acknowledged a site that it has trauma, but I'd kind of worked with Mick and Amos and kind of presented it in a different way. And so it was no longer a shameful thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, it was really interesting. Because you know, you working with such trauma and at a site like that, you feel like you're kind of walking on a knife's edge. Like I feel, you know, like my grandmother was part of the stolen generation, and you know, she always said, "Love, I don't want to talk about the past. I don't want to talk about the past." So I've got this kind of deeply ingrained sense of not wanting to kind of bring up the past. So yeah, but I think collaboration is incredibly important, and developing ongoing relationships.
So that idea also of the transformative power of creative design thinking as a way of taking something which is inherently challenging in many respects, but then enabling that to actually be transformative to the extent that one can actually embrace it, and therefore it's taking that, I guess, artistic sensibility as a way of looking at it with slightly fresh eyes. Is there something in that as a way of operating and engaging with often those difficult truths?
I think there is. And I think there's, you know, we talk about deep listening, and, you know, that's not just a yarning circle and then you know, you bugger off in the next light aircraft, or, you know, I mean, everywhere is Indigenous land. And so it's not just in a remote area or in a rural area. And quite some of the major insights that I have, and this is again about the way that people communicate, is the post-meeting line where you're all, and I think everyone who's in this room would have this, is you've had the meeting and then you're standing outside. You were smoking because you smoked then, and you might still smoke, but you don't admit it anymore. And someone says, they make a line of it. And that's the bit where you know, well, actually, it's not time to bugger off. Let's leave this and revisit it in a week, because we're not necessarily on the time schedule that is set. So I think a lot of architects and a lot of designers and a lot of artists put a lot more time in than we're paid for, because we're really committed to getting that right message, or to standing by someone where they've, you know, they're deeply traumatised and finding the right services.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing there is the importance of generosity, of empathy, and also acknowledging that the sort of fly in, fly out mentality isn't necessarily going to be fit for purpose, that you actually need to facilitate and enable time. And often it's those words and conversations that's actually had between the formal presentation or what have you is often where you glean the most information.
And yeah, and it's an interesting one, because on the Unkunjari lands, which is nearly 1/3 of South Australia, when that land claim was put, you know, it was given free as freehold land in 1989, there was a stipulation that nobody was to fly in, fly out, that everybody had to drive in, which is a good 20-hour drive. Of course, that's changed because politicians change and timing changes and things like this. But making that time, and this is the bit where I guess taking your kids or doing, you know, if people have got the generosity to bring their children to a workshop, then why wouldn't I have a generosity to bring my grandchildren, or to make this a meal, or, and this might be the only opportunity that people get as a social thing to travel to Melbourne or to travel to Sydney to see their, see one of Peter's, is that the right pronunciation, Peter? Hello?
Sorry, I just had to press unmute. Yes, Peter.
Yeah. You know, this is very important, that that people are invited to see these exhibitions or to see the buildings. And I've actually only seen one situation of where the client stood up next to the architect and won a national award, and that was, you can look at Tom E. Lewis, stood up next to, I can't remember the architect's name, but I remember it was Tom E. Lewis, who stood up and accepted the award for the building. And that made me as proud as punch. And it's also, you know, in terms of my collaborations, one of the things that I really like doing is when we get the architects in. And I've been working on a number of Aboriginal children and family centres. So we have, you know, we have numbers of meetings upon meetings upon meetings and lunches and drive arounds and things like this, is when the head honchos come down, is that we always take photographs. And we take lots of photographs and we deliver the individual photographs to the families concerned. And where that's not, we print them off, we laminate them, and we give them, and we tell them that we will not use a picture without their consent. So we've got the names of everyone. One of the things that I really like to do is when the whole design team, which includes the traditional owners and the kids and everything else, is we put the traditional owners and the Aboriginal people front and centre in that photograph. It's hilarious. It's a really enjoyable thing to do. And after the meeting, it's the understood that they're just using the knowledge as a vessel. That's all we're doing, just using that knowledge, and we're melding 4 or 5 different worlds together.
So I'm just mindful of time. So I'm going to finish off with one question, which is really, how do we maintain longevity in a career which also acknowledges Indigenous perspectives into our various modes of practice? And what tips might we be able to give to those who are listening today in how to really amplify the opportunities over the duration of a career? So playing the long game rather than sort of that idea of the sort of transactional fly in, fly out mentality, but one which can be enduring and facilitates meaningful impact in what we do. Peter, what's your reflections on that?
Well, I think it's about maintaining relationships and over time, and maybe revisiting the relationships over time. So allowing the relationships to grow over time and to not kind of move on to the next kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question to really ponder on, to think about how to kind of maintain kind of a longevity. But I think my main thought would be maintaining and nurturing relationships. I think that's...
Yeah, I think mine, I'm still really, really angry. You know, as long as one Indigenous kid or one Indigenous mother still gets locked up, I'm still really, really angry. And I still think that changing architecture from really big institutions to giving people the room to heal in a de-institutional environment and can still work. And I guess my focus has never changed in the last 30 years. I'm still really angry. And I guess we can use, you know, I see architecture as a way to build pride, but at the same time, I'm still really angry. And it was interesting, you know, I guess the Black Lives Matter movement was really interesting for me, because it was finally a time where I guess all of the anger was being exhibited, and I just think that we've got to change this really unequitable world we live in. And I think until we understand different people's perspectives and we treat people with kindness and respect, and we value cultures, that it's not going to change. But gee, I'd like it to change in my lifetime.
Yes, well, that's you know, an optimistic place to perhaps end the conversation before we move on to Q&A. But I think there's a number of key themes that I've sort of taken from this conversation, particularly around the importance of relationships, of facilitating enduring relationships which are strengthened over time, the importance of listening, but listening deeply, considering and acknowledge the importance of respect, of acknowledgement, of humility, of understanding different perspectives, but also acknowledging the contribution of Indigenous voices as well, but also thinking a little bit further in terms of how do we actually build our own capacities and resources and have the requisite language and capacities to engage with some of the complexity. And that's really about us building our own cultural intelligence. And what I also sort of took from the conversation is the importance of understanding that there is in fact a lot of deep wisdom and knowledge that resides in over 67,000 years of history. And then naturally enough, we can't do it alone. You know, for instance, in the architecture domain, as best as we can determine, there's maybe 25 people who've graduated from schools of architecture in the entire country. There is probably maybe 6, 7 registered Indigenous architects in private practice in the whole country ever. So we need to walk in partnership with non-Indigenous people, because there is just too much to do for too few. And so that idea of meaningful partnerships and collaboration is certainly part of the picture. And you know, those who wish to walk with us are very much encouraged to do so, but also understanding the sovereign relationships that Indigenous people maintain and hold, and the fact that, you know, the land was never ceded. That is a truism. And so how do we work within that acknowledgement? And I think there is certainly room for optimism, particularly in the context of Victoria, where we're talking about treaty. We've never had a treaty. So what might that mean for the discipline of the built environment? And how do we need to adapt and change to meet that new reality on the horizon? So I'd just like to leave it there. I've really enjoyed the conversation with both Peter and Elizabeth, and you know, very stimulating. And I think it poses, you know, many questions. I think in some respects we aren't able to really answer all the questions, but we can certainly pose some engaging questions, which hopefully people will sort of work through as they start to engage further, learn more, start to carve out a role and a contribution within the various professions that you might walk into. But ultimately, it's really about celebrating, you know, celebrating our shared humanity, celebrating our shared connections, and acknowledging the diversity of different voices. So thank you. As we would say, Maru Yanaya, or go well. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I believe we have the opportunity for some Q&A if people are able to stick around.
Oh, gone, I think.
So how are we moderating the questions? Do we just want to bring up the chat function and I sort of read through a series of the questions? Might that be the easiest way?
Yeah, I'm happy for you to take charge. Yeah, just pick and choose what questions. Everybody don't be shy. yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think, or even just some comments would be great too.
Yeah, certainly.
I think I better go because this little...
Yes, you are juggling little one, so certainly understand that. But
I must
so much
say,
for your time,
Peter, that has actually been one of the most joyful things of sitting on this today, to watch you juggling that little one.
He was just really
Agreed.
yanking at my hair. I think he quite likes some Zoom conversations. Jeff has met him before.
That's right. Well, that's what it's about. It's about people. It's about family. It's about connections. You know, as you'll see, you know, invariably, the more you work with Aboriginal people, the more you realise that family's part of the picture. We don't sort of segment and say, "Oh, sorry, kids, you're not allowed here." No, they come wherever we go.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a gorgeous little mukapuna.
All right, you're tired, aren't you? He's learned how to do the duck. So occasionally he'll do that, but he hasn't done that. All right, say goodbye. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Well, thanks for your generosity of time too, Peter.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you. Bye.
So there was one interesting question here. It was about this idea of projects as potentially being too small to collaborate. And so I kind of switch the proposition and the question around and say, well, what is the appetite, the risk appetite, to have it all go pear-shaped if you don't bring people on the journey with you? So, you know, a project can be big or small, and I've done projects which are tiny. Like we did a project at RMIT, as it happens, and it was an 80 square metre site, tiny, a little garden, but that didn't stop us from engaging. We just had to find the way to carve out the time to have a meaningful conversation with those who need to engage with the project. And so there is always an opportunity to have a conversation, and it can be formal, it can be informal. It's really about you know, demonstrating that notion of respect, to say, well, hang on, why wouldn't we have a conversation? Yeah, it's and often the question is around time. And so for me, it's about saying sometimes you actually have to slow down to speed up. Mm. And so knowing too that flexibility of time is elastic. It is not something that is so rigid that it can't be changed, because ultimately, if you don't engage and then you get pushback, then it's going to take you longer. So it's actually often saves you time for taking out the necessary time at the front end. And the earlier you do it, the easier it is, because it means that you haven't come with pre-form views and it becomes an imposed solution. It becomes something which is done in partnership. Are there any other questions or comments?
Elizabeth, you were on mute then. Did you have something you wanted?
Oh, yeah, I'll unmute. Jeff, I'm at RMIT, and so we absolutely love that project of yours, and we're very, very proud of it. But one of the other things about small projects is they can often become larger. And I've worked on a number of Aboriginal children and family centres, and when people say, oh, they're kindies. They're not. They're community centres, they're language centres, they're place for youth justice, they're places for a whole range of different things. And we had this wonderful opportunity when the COAG money came out and they were going to give us 4 transportables. And we moved these projects from being transportables to each being $5 million buildings. And they are worth every cent that you've got it, because we basically, for 3 groups, we stopped the pipeline from care to custody. And, that was a really, so projects are not necessarily small. The smallest project can be the most important project.
Indeed. There was a terrific question here from Tim, who's asking the question around treaty in the Victorian context, and what that might mean for the built environment. and what are the impacts to the community potentially as well. So certainly I think there is a likelihood for treaty to occur that we need to ultimately start to shift the way in which we practice. And so this idea of culturally responsive design practice will then become a key and an integral part of the way in which we engage, because what that essentially means is there will be codified a sovereign relationship. So the sort of the governance and the acknowledgement of the roles and responsibilities and obligations that both the state has, but equally traditional owner groups, recognised Aboriginal parties, land councils and the like will therefore hold. So they'll actually require a different way of working. And so what that presupposes in many respects is the necessity of building capability and skills to start to strengthen those relationships, to enable those connections to start to happen, and build methodologies which enable one to engage in meaningful ways beyond the superficial, because that's just ultimately not going to cut it. So that becomes a really important element to consider is, do we have the requisite skill set? Are we learning these things within our design training, for instance? Is there a need to start to shift the way in which we educate the future built environment professionals to accommodate these requirements, these critical skill sets?
And to add to that, Jifa, is that one of the things, you know, we can look to countries like South Africa, post-apartheid. We can look to other countries, but we can also look to South Australia, which has got a document called the Letters Patent. And that document technically allows Aboriginal people to move in whatever way they want to and to preserve sacred sites. And I would equally like to see, while the treaty is coming on, is that the letters patent are tested. And this is going to be a really interesting one, because this is a worldwide event. South Africa's had issues with the way they've done it. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from around the world. I mean, Turtle Island have had issues with the way treaties are. And so this is going to be something completely new. I've got enormous faith in most of the people, or all of the people who are sitting on those treaty committees for Victoria. I think it's an outstanding group of people.
One of which is a trained architect, as it happens as well. A good friend of mine, Ruben Berg.
That's right, Ruben's on there, yes.
So there was a good question, or a bit of a comment from Kim Bridgland from Addition Office, who's a fantastic practitioner, really about understanding the importance of how we start to normalise an exposure to Indigenous culture as part of the standard ways of practice. And so if the starting premise is all projects are built on Indigenous lands, then whether you're in a major metropolis like Melbourne or you're in a remote part of Australia, these are all on Indigenous land. So that becomes a pivot point of how we start to acknowledge and start to build visibility of Indigenous culture within the mainstream experience of our daily lives in our cities, towns, regional centres, wherever you are. And so I think certainly there's an important element there to say we should be exposed to these sort of conversations throughout our design training, and then it should become normalised as part of professional practice. And then, you know, unless it's raised as an issue, and sometimes people try and avoid it because they put it in the sort of too hard basket. But ultimately, what I like to sort of, as a sort of key take-home message from today, is to say, well, it's not too hard. If you've got the goodwill, if you've got the intent to put in the requisite time, if you're prepared to research and learn and to build your own capacity, these conversations can certainly be had. They can certainly also provide design inspiration. So this is something that we often don't talk about. You know, the depth of wisdom and knowledge of country can actually become the stimulus to start to take us in a different direction as it relates to the design solution in which we come upon as we start to engage in this collaborative model. So this is something we can certainly celebrate as part of the experience, part of the journey that we go on as we engage with different projects. And if we start with a question of, isn't there an Indigenous story that can be told through this project? And if the answer comes back yes, then how do we realise it? And that's where the creative capacity of designers, of architects, of landscape architects, of other design professionals can really start to come into the fore, providing that we've built up our capacity and started to stretch ourselves to start to engage with some of the complexity. So for me, it's something that is quite exciting. I don't see it in this sort of problematizing of Indigenous culture. I see it as providing further opportunity through a design lens as well. So I think we might be pretty close to the end. I see one other question. Just reading through it. Are there particular resources that can be read or skills to work on to try and develop one's sensibility? And that's certainly a terrific question by Thomas Kelly. And it's a question that we often get. But certainly it starts with reading. There's some terrific publications out there. Obviously the work of Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage and Uncle Stan Grant. There's terrific publications which have been undertaken specifically on the relationship between indigeneity and architecture, one of which I was a part of, called Voices, Indigeneity in Architecture. Elizabeth was also a editor of a terrific companion on Indigenous architecture as well. There are countless resources out there. Working with and engaging with your profession is certainly something that one can start to connect in with. The only peak Indigenous design body representing Indigenous people, Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, is again another terrific resource. But be wary of bombarding traditional owner groups. They are certainly under-resourced. If every student who's doing a project seeks to sort of tap into speaking to traditional owners, they would certainly be very stretched, as they already are. So they often have to triage projects that they engage with. So respecting and understanding some of those challenges is certainly something to consider. But any good library in any university or the state library, there are countless resources out there. There's some terrific websites, of which Elizabeth has a Facebook site
so
too.
Actually, well, just going into that, is that we've been running a Facebook page. I reckon it's been up to 20 years now, and it started as a student project when Facebook came out. And anyone is welcome to come on that as an editor. And it sometimes it's just called Indigenous Architecture. And it's got very outdated images on it, but have a look at it. Look up something up. But it does have good links on it. There's a whole lot of people on it. Some of the stuff's good, some that's not so good. But I do think I would just, with Jifa's comment about expecting Indigenous people to tell you the answers, is the most lazy way to go. And it's just disrespectful and lazy. To do the reading, and you've got a resource. I think many people in this room will have a television or a computer. NITV is a really fabulous resource.
Yeah.
And there it is.
Yeah. And there's fantastic programs out there like Away on Radio National. It's about engaging with the culture, seeking to find a way in. There's countless exhibition. There's some terrific Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists out there. There's certainly lots of forums and conversations like we're having today, and this is where it starts, with a conversation.
And go and learn a language. We've got 300 endangered languages. Go and learn one. It would be a really wonderful thing to do, whatever your background is. Go and learn a language. To speak to someone in language is quite a remarkable thing.
It's powerful. And know which country you're on, which country you were born on, which language group you live on. That's a good starting point. And once you know that, it opens up possibilities. And I remember a non-Indigenous guy saying to an Aboriginal friend of mine, and he said, we often say where we're from, and you say, my mob is, whatever the language group is, and that's where I'm from. And he said, I am of the whatever language group he lived on. I'm of that nation. So he's acknowledging, as a non-Indigenous person, his connection to that particular language group. And I think that's a real powerful gesture to start to say, well, I am also of this language group because I've lived here, or I've worked here, I was born here, I've been educated here. And so the more you start to reveal, the more you learn, and the more you actually benefit from that cross-pollination and that sort of bicultural experience. And that, I think, is really a terrific way to engage with it. So I think we've come to time, unfortunately, unless there's any last question. I think Sarah was about to say something.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I was going to say, maybe there'd be a few people here interested to know just where they could find those language courses.
There are oops, hang on, am I muted or unmuted? Just look it up. Look them up. There are language courses in just about everywhere, and you can do them online. You can do a Pitjantjatjara course online. You can get with a speaker. You do Yankunytjatjara courses. There are many different language courses. And in fact, most universities are now, we greet each other with Wominjaka. And it is a standard thing. I would say, of not knowing, I mean, it might be a little bit harder than GFA, but if you couldn't go out the front of your house and write whose land you're on chalk, then you've got a problem. This is, and I would get on it. I mean, unfortunately, we're about to lose an anthropologist who will take with him, he's dying at the moment, he will take 7 languages, of which he's the last speaker of.
Well, to that point, Janine says that she's currently learning Wajak Noongar. So you can see
fabulous. That's absolutely fabulous.
It's possible. So
yeah, so that's a great starting point. And what else? That is an absolutely amazing, because there's words in these that we can use in design, and it's got such a respect that that we can actually, within 20 years, make some of these endangered languages vibrant again.
Yes, and I do recall the former CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages who said to me, languages aren't dead, they're just simply dormant.
They're sleeping.
And so that is a really nice way to explain it, to say that, while you might feel that they are gone to history, they can be revived, and they are being revived. Dictionaries are being created on this very day to re-establish some of those lost linkages to different Aboriginal languages, and so that they can always evolve and change, as language always does. And you can fill in the gaps. There are obviously words which would no way have existed in the past, so we have to be creative as well. And language is a creative endeavour in many respects as well. And I see Will Scobie put up a link to a website, firstlanguages.org.au. So you can see there are certainly capacities to find out more, and obviously the internet is a terrific vehicle to find out more. And if you're inquisitive and if you have the interest, the time's now.
I just want to mention that process is so much about handing over to the audience and really asking the audience to, pipe up and ask their questions themselves. So I do acknowledge the time and that it's getting late and everyone has to, get a few things into their
I'm happy to answer any question. If there's anybody who's happy to put their hand up and ask a question, that's the best way one exchanges knowledge, is by speaking with people.
Yeah, we'd love anyone to turn off their mic and ask a question. That would be fantastic. But no pressure. Yeah, Alana, that would be great if you want to ask your question.
There was just a moment, Jeffa, where you mentioned indigenizing procurement. And I wonder if you could say some more about what's happening on that front, and what are some of the systems and processes that are forming, and how can we who work in the public space, what can we refer to especially our government clients and say, hey, are you doing this?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. So procurement's certainly becoming a hot button issue, and wherever possible in a project, if you're able to empower Indigenous enterprise by specifying or calling up or having collaborate Indigenous peoples and businesses, then you're actually really strengthening some of those opportunities. So procurement is often being written into contracts these days, where there's a certain spend or percentage spend relative to the size of the project. The challenge really is finding the various businesses. And, the first port of call people often default to is to engage with Supply Nation, which is a federally funded organisation which has been set up, which lists all the Indigenous businesses. They've all been verified as having bona fides, and they've actually demonstrated their indigeneity. So that is certainly a terrific resource, Supply Nation. The other one is Kinaway, which is the Victorian Aboriginal Chamber of Commerce, which again lists a lot of Indigenous people who have businesses, and a full, everything from lawyers to graphic designers to caterers and everything in between. So you can see that can certainly be something which strengthens projects, but also collaborating with Indigenous creatives. The Korea Heritage Trust, again, is a great resource because they engage with a full gamut of different creative practitioners, artists particularly. And so looking at ways where one can engage with Indigenous people through creative practice can certainly enhance a proposition, whether it's a landscape project, interior project, an architectural project. And then, what that does is it showcases culture embedded within a project. But, one cautionary note is we've kind of got to a level of cultural sophistication where we're moving beyond the sort of muralization of culture, where we're applying the sort of surface treatment and saying, well, doing a mural on the side of the building or hanging a dot painting in the foyer, that just doesn't cut it anymore. We're looking at much more nuanced and sophisticated and subtle ways to embed it within the design thinking as opposed to an afterthought or a graft on.
Mm.
That said about the layering approach, Jifa, it is not a particularly sophisticated approach. Many Aboriginal organisations like to have a mural on the side of their building.
Oh, yes. And this goes back to the getting the cultural authority to proceed. So if the community wants a mural on the side of the building, by all means, and if they're providing the permissions and facilitating the opportunity or engaging with local artists, that is perfectly valid. But from if the starting point is the only way one can express culture is to do a mural on the wall, then you're not delving deep enough, is the idea.
Yeah, and I was wondering if part of our job, of working on projects is that often my discussions start with the murals, and when you start educating the community, they're well past the mural by the time we've finished half an hour, and no murals are to be had But it is certainly a very important thing for many groups to
It's
do
about
that.
giving visibility to culture, isn't it?
Mm.
And Lena has asked the sort of question, or asking whether it's appropriate to say I was born on a particular country, Larrakia, or I was born on the country of the Larrakia people. That is perfectly valid thing to say, because that is true. If you were born on Larrakia country, then you are, connected to those people by extension, and therefore it's certainly valid and fair to say that you are connected to that particular country, not by blood, not by birthright, but by the fact that you have a relationship and a connection to that particular country. And so I encourage all people to understand some of those connections. And so you heard in my introduction how I referenced Gadigal, Darkinjung, Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung. These are all countries that I have a connection to now. Yet my mob is Kamilaroi and Walwan country, northwest New South Wales. So I acknowledge them all. Any further questions as we sort of draw to the end of the evening? I'm sure there's quite a bit to absorb over the course of the evening. There's a sort of a J-curve of information that's been sort of taken on board, and hopefully it's stimulated some questions and provides a mechanism to perhaps think a little bit differently about what your contribution is. And really it's a pretext. It's a pretext to understand our own ethical and philosophical positioning and how we have a part to play. We all are in this together, as the cliche we've heard too often in recent times goes, but ultimately there is an opportunity here to engage in meaningful ways, to build our own capacities and to share in this beautiful ancient land that we all are located on.
I think talking to some of the points that have been raised around like really doing the work, for lack of a better word, and kind of doing that research yourself and not overburdening Indigenous groups for that kind of supply of knowledge and information.
You've got to have skin in the game is the way I say it.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I think, reflecting on our own experience here at Process, going from our last event into this event, we were really, encouraged to kind of really, get some skin in the game. And I think it really showed that it's not just about, it kind of sits in with that discussion interestingly, because we had to do a lot of asking and reaching out, and I think that was absolutely necessary, but kind of getting that right balance between pushing too far and asking too much, I think was a conversation that we were having ourselves a lot. I think there's a bit of it feels like there's a grey area in what's being said in between this kind of not overburdening Indigenous groups and kind of recognizing when, you've asked 20 times for some help and kind of doing that research yourself, and maybe a question from last time came up and seems relevant here. Sorry, I've just lost it. It's just a question around appropriation and how you sculpt and make conversations that are led by, in the absence of Indigenous leaders in those conversations. Where do you draw that line, and how do you bring that knowledge into your own practice when the reality is that you aren't able to draw in that knowledge? Maybe you could speak a little bit, Jiva.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and it's one which I think many people grapple with, and it's really about the difference between, and there's subtlety in language, the difference between appropriate and appropriate, spelled exactly the same way. And so ultimately it's about not hoovering up Indigenous knowledge or imagery or references or forms of cultural expression and claiming it as your own. So it requires acknowledgement, it requires, where you are unable to have those meaningful conversations, to think a little bit more innovatively. So sometimes, and this is the way I often come at it as a design practitioner, is to use the method of adaptation. So it's being inspired by, but not necessarily replicating or being representational, but taking, in my own mind's eye, what are the ingredients which stimulate and inspire? But it does require a degree of investment by doing the necessary research to understand what it means. So to give a perfect example, the project we did at RMIT Nagara Place, we were going to incorporate wattle because we wanted to have an Indigenous palette in terms of the landscape intervention as part of this proposition. And so we chose plants from the bioregion of the Kulin Nation, expressing the 7 seasons of the Kulin Nation. And we used plant species which were medicinal plants, edible plants, plants used for utility like weaving, using plants for their form, their colour, their sensory engagement. And then when we came to the selection of wattle as being sort of almost emblematic of an Australian landscape, in conversations with a Kulin elder, we soon realised that the wattle is often used in mourning practice. So that therefore puts a completely different slant on how one might understand the use of that particular choice in a design proposition. So the research, the conversation actually enabled us to understand that before we made that sort of cultural faux pas where we've called up a plant which might be seen in a completely different light for Indigenous people. So you can see how the criticality of engaging deeply and trying to learn as much as you can often avoid some of these potential missteps, but it also builds your own cultural intelligence and awareness to understand some of the nuance, some of the subtlety.
Just to add to that, oops, hang on, am I on? Yes.
Yeah, you're on.
As a fairly seasoned teacher of design, plagiarism is plagiarism.
That's right.
And if you have gone and you've appropriated someone's culture into your project as a student, then you deserve, and I'm going to be quite blunt, to be hauled over the coals for plagiarism. And I've seen quite a number of students that have gone, oh, well, this is Australian. We'll just pop this thing in here and we'll pop that thing in there. It's not acceptable anymore. We're at a level to which we have, this stuff has been in the mainstream for the last 20 years. It's for you to educate yourself and to do the research.
And hence the reason, for instance, we created the International Indigenous Design Charter. It's a document of a series of protocols, if you will, to step through and pressure test your own culturally responsive design practice and how you go about it. And one of those points includes understanding Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights. And so ultimately, some of these things aren't considered in the mix, but if you truly want to be responsive through design practice and facilitate cultural respect, then those sort of steps can actually be quite valuable in avoiding some of the issues that might transpire downstream, particularly when you're in professional practice. As a student, obviously, one can be much more forgiving, but when you get out there in practice, if you're going to take on board Indigenous motifs or totems or cultural references, you can often be playing with fire if you do it wrong, and if you go down a path where you're actually doing something which can pose some real challenges for particularly traditional owners in terms of seeing something used in a way which is inconsistent with the way in which the traditional owners would typically engage with it.
I think something I'm taking away from this conversation is that there are those aspects that we've just talked about, which are very much appropriation and not to be done. But there are also those larger methodologies that we can draw from Indigenous knowledge and practice that is incredibly relevant to architecture and design related fields that can be applied across, design fields. So things like, as we've discussed, this deep listening, relationship creation, collaboration and design thinking processes. I think that this way of thinking really challenges the stasis that work culture and the processes in architecture that we've really seen solidify and really, over time. And the fact that we need to talk about carving out time to engage with Indigenous knowledge is, I think, a great example of the road that we've gone down in architecture. And that language has to be associated with that, it's so tight and we have to fit so much into it. Maybe it's actually a good gateway to start engaging with our own approaches and practices too.
Yeah, because things aren't static. Indigenous people wouldn't have lasted on this continent for 6,000 or 7,000 years without the ability to change and adapt. And ultimately, the profession will need to change and adapt to meet the new realities on the horizon. Principles and ideas like caring for country has an ancient antecedents. It's essentially saying that you only take that which you need. It's a holistic worldview and practice, which is, I would argue, the first form of sustainability. And so ultimately, those sort of principles can be embedded within any design practice. That's not appropriation. That's actually just doing the right thing. And so, for me, yes, it might have a connection ultimately back to Indigenous cultures, and there's great wisdom there. We can certainly learn a lot from Indigenous culture as well.
Well, unless anyone has any more questions, I am delighted to wrap up and thank our speakers, Elizabeth, Grant and Jifa. Thank you so much for being here and having this conversation. And of course, thanks to Peter Clancy as well, who did an amazing job juggling
multitasking.
Fluently at the same time. I was really impressed by that. I'd also, while you're all here, like to thank Loot Bar for hosting us and kind of pushing us online. They really promoted for us to be here and are really helping us make sure that this conversation doesn't just exist here, but exists as a real reference conversation. And so we'll be sharing that to YouTube. You can also watch our last event, which we had 2 months ago, and it's up on YouTube. You can find that through our Instagram page. So please seek that out, and it gives a great contrast to the discussion we've had here tonight. Yeah, I think that's about it. We're very happy to be online. We're really glad that you all stuck around. And yes, Olivia says that we are editing out everyone's faces, so don't be too worried. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Cheerio.
Thanks so much.